Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and we're taking a look today at some new controllers from 8bitdo. This is their new SN30 line, which are Super Nintendo-inspired controllers, and they are this year making them in the colors of the Game Boy Pocket, as you can see here. Internally, they're largely the same as some of the prior controllers that we've looked at here on the channel, namely this older SN30. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that have improved on this controller line over the last couple of years. Those improvements are in these devices, but you can also, in most cases, update the firmware on your older controllers to get some of these performance enhancements. So we're going to talk about what you can do with these things in just a second. But I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that this came in free of charge from 8bitdo. However, all the opinions you're about to hear are my own. Nobody is paying for this review, nor has anyone approved or reviewed what you're about to see before it was uploaded. And over the years, I've bought a lot of these controllers myself as well because I really do like them. So let's get into it now, see what these new controllers are all about, and then we'll see how they've made them a little better over the last couple of years. So let's take a closer look now at the hardware. 8bitdo offers two versions of this controller in different colors. They have the standard SN30, which largely replicates the Super Nintendo controller design. This one sells for $29. It's wireless with Bluetooth support, and it also supports direct connection via USB, and we'll test out its lag and latency in a few minutes. And if you're just playing emulators or retro games that are just strictly 8 or 16-bit or whatever, this controller should be just fine for that. But if you are playing more modern games, including some of the retro-inspired modern games, you probably need more controls like analog sticks or additional trigger buttons on the top of the controller. And that's what the Pro controller will bring you. It costs about $44, so a little more than the basic one here. But it does add those analog sticks, some motion controls that even work on the Switch, along with rumble motors too. So it's more of a modern interpretation, yet it feels about the same in the hand. It's a little bit heavier, but it is about the same size as the regular Super Nintendo controller is. And I use these quite a bit. I really like these a lot. So you do have the option to play some of your modern games with a more retro type of controller if you want to do that. And again, we'll look at the latency scores on these two and compare them to the Switch Pro controller in a minute. Now, these controllers work pretty well on the PC and the Mac. On the PC side, when you connect them up via Bluetooth or a direct USB connection, they will show up as an X input device, which is essentially the same protocol that the Xbox One controller uses when it is attached to your computer. So just about anything you might run, including emulators, should work fine. It also works with the Raspberry Pi, so if you have one of those emulation stations installed on there like RetroPie, not an issue with these controllers. It should come up without any problems there. It also works on Android devices like the NVIDIA Shield, so you can play some of your retro emulators on Android the same way. I think they have a bracket available for these too, so you can mount your smartphone on it as well. So there's a lot of options for doing that with the Bluetooth connection. It also works with the Nintendo Switch, and over the last couple of months, the firmware has gotten better about pairing with the Switch. It's a lot less painful than I remember it being a few months ago. So that is an option too that we'll show you in a few minutes here as we work our way through the review. Now, there are different connectivity options depending on which controller you choose. So the Pro controller comes with a USB Type-C connection. The other controller here connects up via micro USB. There's a small battery inside that should get you about the same battery life you typically get from a first-party game controller. I would just suggest charging them up when you're not using them. There are mode switches that you have to go through. They are now including some instructions on the back of the controller to remind you what the button combinations are to put it into that mode. So it's fairly easy to get it working on the platform of your choice. Now, one of the things we always do here on the channel is test the latency or lag of the controller. How long does it take for a button push to register on the screen? And I was surprised with what we saw out of these controllers. Latency has always been a hit or miss thing with these devices, but they've been making some improvements, I think. So I want to start off with our direct USB tests, and we'll begin with the green controller here. We connected them up to my gaming PC, which has a 144 hertz display. We're using a little joystick testing application to see how long it takes for the button push to get registered by that application. And we shoot the screen and the controller at 240 frames per second with my iPhone and then measure how many frames it takes for the response to register. That's our methodology. It's not exactly perfect, but it gives us a good sense as to how one controller does versus the other. The green controller here got around 48 milliseconds from the time the button was pushed to when things registered on screen, which is very, very good for a third-party controller. In fact, it's about what I usually see out of my Xbox One controller connected up via USB to that same PC. That's usually our controller, if you will. So that's a very good outcome here. And I think if you are playing emulators, you'll get very, very low latency even on the inexpensive controller. The Pro controller did even better. This one came in at 36 milliseconds, which was very low, and about the same response rate we saw from the 8bitdo arcade controller I bought a few months ago. So very, very good response out of the Pro controller, again connected up directly via USB. Now what surprised me about these tests when I ran them was that these newer controllers seem to be doing a lot better than the older ones with the same model name. So I went back to my old Pro controller and put the latest firmware on there from the 8bitdo website, and it too saw an improvement in performance on that USB connection. So I think if you have an older controller, before you run out and buy one of these, install the latest firmware. That might give you some improvement in performance. The new Pro controller, though, did do a little better than the original did even after that firmware update. It was running about 7 to 10 milliseconds faster on the new one versus the old one. So if you are looking to buy one, maybe look for this newer one in the new color scheme here, because I think there's probably been some hardware revisions that contribute to that performance improvement. But nonetheless, even the firmware update did make a difference. And that's one of the things with these 8bitdo controllers that I recommend you do, which is, go on their website every couple of months and make sure you have the latest firmware update, because they really do seem to get better in their performance when those updates are installed. And it also looks like 8bitdo has improved the Bluetooth performance of these controllers. So the green one here, the lower cost one, was around 80 to 90 milliseconds when connected up via Bluetooth to a PC. Not bad. The Pro controller is doing a lot better than the original did, coming in at around 70 to 80 milliseconds, give or take, when hooked up to a PC. We also saw similar performance when connecting up to the Nintendo Switch, which means that the Pro controller at the moment has about the same latency as the Nintendo Pro controller does, which costs a lot more. So this was definitely a nice improvement we've seen here with the new hardware and the new firmware. And again, I think if you have one of these controllers and haven't updated that firmware in a while, doing so will bring you a significant decrease in overall lag and latency. And I also found that it's pairing up a lot more reliably to the Switch now. The process is the same. You have to go to your home screen here and go over to System Settings. You then go all the way down to Controllers and Sensors and go to Change Grip Order. And then on the SN30 controller, you hold down Y and Start. That will put it into its switch mode. And then you hold down the select button, and within a second or two, it usually shows up here on the Switch and ready to pair up. So generally, here it goes. It's a very quick process. It wasn't always as reliable on the original controller we looked at a year ago, but now it is moving a lot better than it used to. And again, if you do the firmware update, you should see a similar improvement there. The Pro controller has a similar pairing process. It's Y and Start, but you hit the pairing button here at the top to get everything paired up with it. And just make sure that the games you're playing don't need those two trigger buttons that are lacking on the lower cost controller. So this again is another argument for maybe looking at the more expensive Pro controller. And here's a great example of that. Here I'm playing Double Dragon on the new Switch Online perk here, which is those classic NES games. And I can play the game just fine. I can pause it and use the select button and everything, but what I can't do is do the save states, because those require the ZL and ZR buttons, which are those lower triggers, which I don't have. So if I push these two shoulder buttons here, nothing happens. The menu doesn't come up or anything else like that. I have to go back to my Joy-Cons here to be able to do a save state, for example. So maybe it gives you, like, that original NES challenge, and that you really have to play the game the old-fashioned way without a save state, but you really can't get access to those menus or anything else on there. Overall gameplay here feels pretty nice on these. They did a very nice job of matching how the original Super Nintendo controllers felt. These feel very close to the ones you might get with the SNES Classic Edition consoles. So there's a real, I think, a very realistic feel to these controllers. The D-pad might be a little looser than I remembered the Super Nintendo controllers being, but of course my Super Nintendo controllers now are close to 25 years old, if not older, so maybe they're a little more worn in, but overall I found these controllers to very much allow my muscle memory from my earlier childhood to just work again. So they did really capture the real look and feel of the original controllers. And even the Pro controller, with all of its added buttons here, does feel pretty close to the original in a very familiar way to game, especially on some of these retro games. So my recommendation is to go with the Pro controller, especially if you plan to use it with the Switch, or maybe play some of the more retro-inspired modern games that are out there. You're probably going to need those trigger buttons that are lacking on the lower-cost controller here. But if you're just looking to do some emulation and want to get a bunch of cheap controllers and invite a bunch of folks over to play some 4-player Mario Kart or something, this is probably a very effective way to do it. It doesn't cost all that much. And if you are connecting these up via USB to your Raspberry Pi or your Windows PC, either one is going to deliver very low latency. They've really made some improvements here, mostly in software, but a little bit on the hardware too, which is why I'm going to recommend that you look for these newer controllers to get the best possible latency out of it. Unfortunately, though, those USB connections do not work with the Switch. It does, though, work with Android and Windows and Mac, so you will gain some of the benefits of that direct USB connection on most of the computing platforms, just not on the Switch side of things here. And they continue to make really high quality stuff here, and it keeps getting better, better than it was when we first tested it. So this was a good excuse to kind of go back and revisit where their line of controllers are at the moment. And I welcome your thoughts and comments down in the comment section below. And until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Chris Allegretta, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, Gerard Newberg, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.